I'm going to tell you a story. As the title says, I'm going to tell you a story. Elephants could fly, and this is supposed to be true. Going back into mythology, and there's this textbook that I follow, like the Shastra, which is the science of elephants, and the textbook is a few thousand years old. And the story goes like that. Back in the past, elephants could fly and go anywhere as they pleased. The author of the Gajashastra writes this, that the elephants could go anywhere they pleased and assume any shape. They roamed as they liked in the sky and on the earth. Up in the north, they say in the foothills of the Himalayas, there used to be a huge ficus tree where the elephants would congregate, rest on the branches of this huge ficus. At one point, there were sages who were doing penance under this tree, and the crowding of elephants led to breaking of one of the branches, and that disrupted their prayers and their penance. Hence, the sages cursed that the elephants would lose their wings and that they would be restricted to the land going forward. I've always been passionate about elephants. I grew up with elephants. I listening to elephant tales as a kid. All that I heard as a child were stories about elephants and their mahouts. And as a kid, this is what we used to get to do. This is not my photo. This is my ancestor's picture, including that of my father. And when I grew up, I had very little doubt as to what I wanted to do in my life as a career, pursue as a career. Now, coming back to the story that I mentioned about the Gajashastra, mentioned from the Gajashastra, there are a lot of parallels with that in today's world. Today, because of extensive human pressures with developing infrastructure, with the loss of elephant habitats to different developmental activities, we have elephants losing their wings, that they are restricted from going everywhere as they please. Elephants are coerced to adapt to changing environments. This is a wild elephant, not a captive elephant. Elephants are forced to adapt to changing environments and make sure they change their habitat and ecology so as to ensure their long-term sustenance in the days of these changing environments. Now, these are animals that have large resource requirements. Elephants feed for up to 16 hours a day, consuming about 5% of their body weight, which means that's roughly about 200 kilos of food a day for an adult. And they also range far and wide in search of various resources such as food, water, mate, etc. Now imagine these widespread habitats of these species being interrupted by linear intrusions such as railway lines, highways, dams, reservoirs, and other developmental projects. This is what you are inevitable to be meeting with. You have increasing overlap, spatio-temporal overlap between people and elephants. As a kid, when I got more and more interested in elephants, trying to understand them close enough, one thing that I repeatedly came across in newspapers was this categorization of elephants as menace. And all that the media, in fact, unfortunately, the trend continues even today, that all that the media portrays the elephants as are beasts, marauders, and problem animals. Is that really the case? Is something that always pondered me. When I moved to do my bachelor's and later on my master's and started studying elephants out in the wild, following them, I had more, as I started understanding more and more about elephants, there were more questions as well. And these questions also tried explaining things to me, that what we see on media is not what it actually is. And the ground situations were completely different. And what was even more complex was the broad generalization of elephants as a species rather than looking at them as individual complex beings. They are highly idiosyncratic, and any attempt to generalize and say that elephants do this particular thing is just a huge injustice to the species. Now, then I started looking at various other things that really happened at the interface of elephants and humans, pursuing as a career and looking at them more academically. One thing that I was really interested was to understand the what is broadly called human-elephant conflict. And this is a problem that we are facing today. It is going to intensify in the coming days if appropriate measures are not taken. Now, in my early days of academic the problems were complex, the problems were not the same everywhere, and we needed to understand them at each site, at each individual elephant or each individual group level. And one thing that I really wanted to understand was to measure the losses incurred, not on the human side, but on the elephant side. A lot of studies, including media reports, were focused on the losses incurred because of this interaction between humans and elephants on the side of humans in terms of how many lives lost, how many crops are damaged, what is the economic loss, and so on. But what are the losses on the side of the elephants? Nobody really knew it. Nobody really had questioned it until then. I wanted to try and understand how elephants respond to human presence. Now, what happens when an elephant comes into a human habitation? What is the immediate human response? It is indeed that of panic, stress, anxiety attacks, yes, but there's also another response, that you want the elephant out of your vicinity. You want the elephant out of your agricultural land. You want the elephant out of your habitation. And this is not different for any species. Even if you find this is what you would immediately respond to. My study looked at elephants responded to these drive events where elephants are being chased like this using vehicles. And I found that elephants did have a peak stress response to these drives. But what interested me even more was the fact that elephants were, the hypothesis that elephants were likely to be stressful living in anthropogenic habitats didn't really hold true. We found that elephants that actually live in human habitations or human use landscapes such as these in these small fragments, when left undisturbed, close to base. This was measured through hormones, where I followed individual elephants, picked up their dung as they defecated, took it into a lab and processed them for hormones. The next question in my mind was to try and understand how old this problem is, the problem of human-elephant interaction, the problem of human-elephant conflict. If you just do a random Google search, you would see interesting articles that would tell you that this is a recent trend, this is a problem that is of recent, this is something that we're seeing a decade and a half or so. You might even see that in government reports. Now, going back to the Gajashastra, yes, it is a centuries-old textbook, and the opening part of the Gajashastra, which is about 600 years old, if you look at Matanga Leela, there is one interaction between the king of Anga, the kingdom of Anga is present-day Orissa and East India, and the asking why the peasants at his court, and the ministers respond that the here to complain about the loss of elephants getting into the croplands. Used to occur even back then. Now, how are the solutions back then? The king of Anga, King Romapada, immediately responded to his minister, ordering that the elephants be captured immediately and taken into captivity as a solution to this never-ending problem of elephant conflict. There has been significant scientific and technological advancements since then. We have come a long way, and several centuries have passed since Nilakanta, the author of the book, actually wrote that treatise. But what are our responses to these problems? What are our responses when elephants get into croplands? What are our responses when there are losses incurred because of elephants moving through croplands? It has not changed one bit. We still continue to use our archaic techniques of capturing elephants and taking them into captivity. Have we really tapped into the potentials of scientific and technological advancements to try and see if there are better ways in mitigating this problem? Or that the archaic way of removing elephants from a problem area would resolve the problem immediately? Absolutely not. There are landscapes in 60 removed in as that landscape. So then, where do you draw the line? Where do you try and understand what are the solutions going forward? This is not, this is also a disaster in some sense, because most such measures, now if you go to Africa, poaching and culling here is a population control strategy in Africa, and the parallel to that is capturing elephants as a conflict mitigation strategy in Asian elephants. And when you remove these elephants with for their sociality, you are also not just affecting the elephants that are removed, but are also affecting the individuals that are going to be there, because these are complex that even display stress and associated disorders like PTSD and so on. I'm just going to give you one example. We're all here in Pollachi, and this is an example that happened very close to Pollachi. This is an elephant that I've known for about 15 years now. Going out and seeing wild elephants. I used to take my motorcycle valley in Coimbatore, and there used to be this gentle animal called Chinnathambi back then who used to frequent those areas. Habituated to people presence. There were people who were watching him and documenting him. Even that, slowly behavioral changes in the animal, and what we eventually saw was how this animal lost fear for humans, eating crops more often, and then eventually getting portrayed as a problem animal. Now, what was the next step? The next step was to actually remove this elephant. The elephant was captured from the Tadagam Valley in Coimbatore, and he was he was fixed with a satellite collar that can be used to track his movements in his release site. So he was released into the Annamalais, very close from here, just a few kilometers from Top Slip he was released. And then less than a week later, he started moving out. He probably was not happy settling down in this new landscape. This was all vegetation that was new to him. And he started moving and moving and moving. And then finally, he reached this place called Madathukulam, which is close to Udumalpete in sugarcane fields. Spent about 2 weeks there because of a court litigation that held on to the orders to capture and remove him from that site, further stressing him out. And eventually, the capture orders came, and the animal was captured from there and put inside a corral. Now, how do you decide where an animal needs to be removed, when an animal needs to be removed? Does removing an animal and putting it elsewhere solve the problem? Clearly not. This is almost like you're trying to shift a problem on your left leg to your right leg. You're only shifting the problem, you're not shifting the animal, or you're not resolving the issue there. So then where do you draw a line and ask these questions about what actually mitigate these problems? Our conventional ways still go back to using elephant-proof trenches, solar fences, and night guarding and driving elephants, all of which have unfortunately miserably failed because of our lack of lack of attempts at understanding the problem closely, understanding the circumstances of the problem closely, and most importantly, prioritizing understanding the behavior of the animal and acknowledging them as individuals. I'm going to also give you another example of this very gentle animal, which I just cannot stop talking about. When I started working in the Annamalais about 10 years ago, this was one individual, one wild elephant that I saw for the first time. My very first sighting of this animal was on November 6th, 2013. And the sight that I had was, there was this public distribution store, there was a ration shop, and people were panicking and gathering around that ration store at around 8 o'clock in the evening, and we stopped by, we are passing by that road on a vehicle, we pull over our vehicle, stop, and then flash our torchlights to spot an elephant just outside the ration store feeding. But eventually there was also a time when people started realizing that this animal is of not so much of a threat, and if you actually manage to allocate your ration within those buildings elsewhere, if you are ready to take proactive steps to mitigate the problem, the animal was also able to coexist with very, very minimal damage in a completely human use landscape. The photograph that you see over here was from August 2015, when the elephant was actually feeding on plantain and jackfruits at the backyard of a house with about 50 to 60 bystanders just standing and watching by. No mock charges, no aggressive displays from that animal, where people and elephants were absolutely ready to coexist with each other. Now, this is a model that ideally one has to think about, but these are large and potentially dangerous animals, and this is something that may not really work everywhere, provided you have sufficient sustainable long-term measures in mitigating the problem. You have potentially successful mitigation measures. you may not be able to actually suggest that coexistence. But that said, if you actually have those measures in place, elephants and people could possibly with minimal damage. The most important behavior in these animals. These, like I said, are extremely complex animals, and they learn within no time. When we speak to the Malasar communities or the Carter communities who train elephants, we can understand how fast an elephant gets trained or how fast an elephant learns its commands. I still remember the time when I was very closely working with the team, and we had to capture an elephant that was responsible for a few human deaths. The elephant had caused about 4 or 5 human deaths in a part of Kerala. The elephant was captured in early 2019. And 3 weeks, roughly about 4 weeks later, there were 2 Malasar boys who were actually taking care of this elephant. And 4 weeks later, this boy actually calls me and said, "Sir, yana nalla pakkitom, or naal vandu parunga sir. The elephant is pretty well trained. We would really like you to come and see us at some point of time." It was just about 30 days since the animal was captured. This animal that had lost its fear for humans, had charged at people and killed people due to unfortunate reasons, who was captured and put inside a 12 feet by 12 feet sized crowd. And when a forest officer and I go there, the first response of the is asking us to enter the kraal. Now, this is a wild elephant a month ago. Caused some aberrant behaviors towards humans, but we were very confident because the animal had already learned that this is something that the animal has to live with, this is something that the animal doesn't have to be afraid of. And I would also like to reiterate the fact that the animal also didn't have any wounds on it. So it is not like the animal was tortured and made to, subside its behavior and then, interact with people in a milder way. So we were able to go inside the kraal and communicate to the animal, touch the animal, try and inspect the animal very gently, which also explains the complexity at which the animal is able to learn these things. Now put this situation back into the wild, and this is exactly how an elephant would learn in the wild as well. The animal would immediately try and understand what are stressful situations, what are threats, utilize to survive. Now, this is a scene from southern Sri Lanka. If you actually take the road that goes outside the Yala National Park, Block 5, you would see a site like this on a fairly regular basis. On the other end of the road, closer to this place called Galgate, there is a temple called the Kataragama Devasthana. And if you actually just see, there are hundreds and hundreds of pilgrims who commute on this road every weekend to visit that temple. And at some point of time, it became a habit that people started feeding elephants on there. So they would buy plantain and oranges and apples and watermelons for the temple to offer pujas, but they would also start feeding these elephants. The elephants have got so habituated, no aggression at all, but these animals are getting fed fairly well. They respond positively to humans, but at the same time have also lost fear for humans. Now, if this feeding stops abruptly, this elephant resort to crop raiding, and then managing these elephants when they go out for crop raiding becomes a huge challenge. There's also this interesting thing about male groups. For those of you who don't know, elephants are social animals that live in matrilineal societies. These are female groups consisting of females of different age classes, and then they also have their dependent juvenile offsprings. And the interesting thing about elephants is also that the group's always led mostly by the oldest female in the group, making them matriarchal. And this is a phenomenon that has been fairly well explained in African elephants and to a certain extent the Asian elephants as well. And male elephants out of their groups when they're just reaching maturity at an age of about 13 to 14, and then seldom associate with the group unless or otherwise they need to find a potential mate from a different group. There's also this widespread notion that male elephants then continue to be solitary, while the fact is associate even when they are males with what are called as all-male groups or bachelor groups, as you can see over here. This was a group of 13 males, of which 12 were tuskers and 1 was a makna. And when I actually sent this picture to some of my colleagues, and the immediate response was, it is just impossible to see these groups. But like I said, there are reports of such all-male groups from various landscapes of late, that there are media reports of how this phenomenon is fairly new. Now this is if you just go back to late 1700s, an erstwhile colonial officer who was actually, capturing elephants, hunting elephants, doing expeditions. Fantastic expedition that he did to Tripura in northeast India. John Course in 1791 writes that male elephants either come out singly or in parties, or called as the Gunda gangs. Now that's exactly what is happening today. Now in 1791, if he has observed, there is no chance that this working in the Annamalais. I was focusing on the Valparai Plateau, and Valparai is not new to most of you who come from Pollachi. It's your nearest hill station. It's a fantastic landscape, but unfortunately dominated by tea and coffee plantations. A pristine rainforest opened up in the late 1800s, making them into fragments. One of the initial ideas was that when elephants come into these tea estates, they are only using them to traverse through and move from one fragment to the other, or using them as nighttime use. But over the years, we have gathered enough data to now show that elephants are able to exist within these tea plantations, again with minimal damage, and also make that a significant part of what are called as home ranges, where elephants have these home ranges within which they use anywhere ranging between 30 to 40 square kilometer to 200 to 300 kilometers, where males could even go up to about 600 square kilometer. And these are elephants that are in Valparai all through the year. They have fairly well to live amidst humans, and provided we take the right proactive mitigation measures, these animals can coexist with humans going forward with minimal loss. So with the elephants, there's no one-stop answer. And if Palnisamy from the Malasar community, who has taught me lots of things in the past, was here, if he was here, he would have also perhaps told you this example, that one of the first things when I started associating with them very closely, I started learning from them. And I must tell you that I've learned from them more than what I've possibly read from a lot of books. And one of the first things that he taught me was, you make a list of 100 things that the elephant will do, and the next day the elephant will do the 101st thing. Sir, நீங்க ஒரு லிஸ்ட் போடுங்க, இந்த யானை பண்ற மாதிரி ஒரு 100 காரியங்கள், இந்த மாதிரி இதை தான் பண்ணும், யானை இதை தான் பண்ணும்னு சொல்லி ஒரு 100 விஷயத்தை போட்டு நீங்க ஒரு லிஸ்ட் போடுங்க, அடுத்த நாளே அது 101வது காரியம் பண்ணும் சார். And that is how complex it is, and that is how complex it is going to be. And unless we start acknowledging these wonderful animals as individuals, wonderful animals as having unique personalities, and try and start using science to understand their behavior very closely, and then using our understanding of in managing their problem, in saving their population, we are bound to actually face the disasters of the century, which is to lose out these magnificent species going forward, because we are losing elephants at alarming rates. We lose roughly about 200 plus elephants due to human-elephant conflict every year in India, and this number is slightly higher in Sri Lanka, which is far more smaller than what India is. And if we are not ready to pledge for conservation of this species going forward, like I said, it is to be the disaster that our generation has seen. That said, I must also tell you that I am still hopeful that we will all be able to save this species from the extinction. We will be able to save the species for our future generations, and there is still light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.